Today we're covering the top budget decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! To find out which ones are the best to compete against the top meta decks. What's potion? You got Matt here and welcome to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Video. Today we're talking about budget decks, which ones are the best, which ones are the worst, and which ones are going to give us the best chance to compete against the top decks in the format. So if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 300 likes, I'll know you want to keep seeing more Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier lists. Also, if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Including deck profiles, guides on how to beat the best decks, meta discussions, and videos just like this one, you're going to love this channel. So make sure to subscribe. But with that being said, here is your guide to the best budget decks in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For the May 2024 format. Let's jump into it. So when it comes to budget decks, the definition varies from person to person. For one person, a deck that costs $150 may seem very affordable, but for another it might break the bank completely. So take these decks with a grain of salt and make adjustments as you see fit based on your budget. But I do have 5 categories to talk about when it comes to these decks. The first one is going to be a top tier threat. This category is for decks that can compete against the best decks in the game today. We also have a decent option, which is for strong decks but aren't going to have enough consistent success against the meta. Good players only is for decks where the pilot needs to be very skilled to bring out the max potential of the deck. Our fourth category today is a real challenge. This is for decks that are struggling today, whether it's because of the ban list or the format changes or any other possible reason it could be, but they could have potential down the line. And finally, our last category, you know it, you love it, it's our just don't tier, which is for decks that you shouldn't be playing in almost any circumstance, but not necessarily because they are bad decks. With that out of the way, I have 25 different decks to talk about today, so let's get started in alphabetical order with ABC. ABC is a great combo deck that utilizes powerful machine monsters, and while it is getting new support in the OCG in the coming weeks, we're not getting that support for quite a while. The deck can set up some really awesome endboards with ABC Dragon Buster, Appaloosa, IP Masquerena, Therion King Regulus, and so on and so forth, and has really unique combos as well. But there are so many hand traps in the format today that the deck can kinda be weak to a few of them. But one of the bright spots for ABC is that all these main deck ABC monsters are not hard once per turns with their effects, meaning you can constantly recycle them over and over and eventually overpower the opponent. But until we get the new support, ABC is a real challenge. Up next is Dark World, and I have a pretty big fear of Dark World. I really hate playing against this strategy because of what it can actually do. It can set up a massive endboard with a ton of negates and interruptions, or just play skill drain beatdown, but the scariest version of the deck is going to be the hand loop combo that the deck can achieve. The deck does have a couple of issues though, and the first one is going to be that the deck needs to play a lot of actual engine pieces to make sure you're discarding the right cards and getting advantage off of them, because if you don't, the combo just ends. And for that reason, you can't play very many hand traps, which means it can't go second as well as we would really like it to. Don't get me wrong, some effects are really powerful and it can definitely break some boards, but that's not what it wants to do. And while Dark World can play around some hand traps, it's an auto loss against others. Think of a hand trap like Dimension Shifter or Droll and Lockbird. If you manage to use either of those hand traps against Dark World, it's pretty much going to be GG. But it's still an incredibly strong deck in the format today that can't be messed with. And for that reason, it's a decent option. Moving on to Dinomorphia. Dinomorphia is a really cool trap fusion strategy that can perform very well in the right situation. The problem with it is that it's a trap deck, which means it has an inherent weakness to going second. But the Dinomorphia cards all have really strong effects and powerful ways to interrupt your opponent, and the peak of that is going to be Dinomorphia Rexstorm, which is essentially a walking skill drain. But it's even better than that in some ways because it stops your opponent from even activating effects of monsters with attack higher than your life points. The issue with that though is that the best cards in the game right now don't have that high of an attack stat. Think of SP Little Knight, that has 1600 attack, which is kinda big for the purposes of Dinomorphia, but then you have something like Snake Eye Ash or Snake Eye Oak or all these really powerful zero attack monsters in the game, including all the Yubel cards. And that's just one issue, but in my opinion, the bigger problem is going to be that games right now go very long, which means we're going to be getting into time procedures. And Dinomorphia, just by nature, reduces their life points all the time to activate their effects, so if their life points are reduced, you know you're going to be losing in time almost all the time. It's because of these reasons that Dinomorphia is a real challenge. Exosister is up next, and I want to say a fun story about Exosister real quick. My wife, who has never played Yu-Gi-Oh before in her life, was hanging out with my friends and I, and my friend said, you know what? let's teach her how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And the deck they chose to teach her with was Exosister, which is pretty funny because it's not necessarily a deck you would use to teach someone the mechanics of the game, but they managed to do it. Now the reason why I wanted to tell this story is because if you're a new player to the game and you have at least a basic understanding of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Works, then you're going to really learn how to play Exosister pretty quickly. And that's good because the deck can do a lot of really cool things. It annoys any deck that can utilize the graveyard, and of course it can always use Dimension Shifter, which is a really solid card in the format today. And also, it's a very consistent strategy thanks to Pot of Prosperities, your Sakitamas and Aratamas, and so on and so forth. Again, I don't think that Exosister is the best choice to teach someone new to the game how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! But if you have a base knowledge already and you want to just start playing in-paper Yu-Gi-Oh! On a budget, Exosister is a great choice, just not at the top of the list. And that's why I think Exosister is a decent option. Fire King Tri-Brigade is also a really cool deck that I honestly love, but the issue with the strategy is that it's still using the Fire King cards, which are very good and very budget. But there are so many decks in the format today that are actively trying to beat decks like Snake Eye or Snake Eye Fire King, and those cards that beat those strategies also beat this one, which can be problematic for a deck that isn't as good as those ones in the format. But the deck does have some really cool plays it can do. It also has some great forms of disruption, and the recurring advantage it gets from the Fire King cards is great, and who doesn't love Shureg non-target banishes? Fire King Tri-Brigade can definitely hold up with some of the best decks in the game, but can it do so consistently? I don't think so, and that's why it's a decent option. Floowandereeze is an awesome budget deck. It can do so many great things, including Dimension Shifter, and of course Harpy's Feather Storm, and obviously Empen, so it basically just floodgates the opponent out of the game kind of, which is, you know, pretty good this format I hear. But honestly, Floowandereeze has a really good time in the meta today because of all these anti-meta cards it can play. It also doesn't really special summon, which means that cards like Promethean Princess don't get their max benefit in the graveyard, and that's a very key thing as well. The engine isn't that strong, and it does have consistency issues from time to time, but when it does pop off, it is very, very good. Now, the deck does want to play copies of Triple Tactics Thrust, which is a very expensive card, and honestly, at the current price of Thrust and the Floowandereeze engine, you can probably fit in one copy at $100, but really it's not that necessary to have. Even without Triple Tactics Thrust, it's still a top tier threat. If you play Ghoti, I have a lot of respect for you. It's a very difficult strategy that's not super easy to learn and does have a hard time this format, but it's a decent anti-meta pick. The issue I have with Ghoti is that if you can't find a way to banish your fishes, your entire strategy kind of falls apart. And in a format where there's 12, 15, sometimes even more than that hand traps in a single deck, it becomes really hard to get your game plan online, and it gets even harder than that if you're going second. Don't get me wrong though, I think the deck could perform well, but it's going to be very difficult to do so consistently. I think Ghoti is a real challenge. Goblin Biker is a really fun deck with a ton of really cool and unique combos as well. The deck can easily go into the Armored Exceeds cards to be able to get access to that form of interruption. It can also pretty easily set up either Asura Priest or the copy of Gossip Shadow for negates, and they can also set up Zeus on the opponent's turn, which is really cool. But of course, the most important thing is it's really good at getting access to its Goblin Biker monsters, which have great forms of interruption too. The problem is, those Goblin Biker cards are really at their best in a format that's dominated by Xyz monsters, and right now we're just not in that situation. It's a solid deck overall, but right now it just feels like it's missing something to be considered a top tier strategy, and that's why I'm placing it in the good players only tier. Moving on to heroes. Heroes are probably the most popular deck I'm going to be talking about in this video. There's a ton of really cool plays the deck can make, including obviously Masked Hero Darklaw, you have Plasma, you have the Dark Angel Lock, and you also of course have DPE. All of these cards are pretty standard setups to have on a hero end board. And while Hero can definitely do very well in the format if it gets access to these really powerful cards, it's not without its weaknesses. Hero is one of those decks that I could make an argument is weak to every single relevant hand trap right now. But while Hero does have its flaws, it's really good at extending past a lot of different hand traps. Most of the time you want to save your Ash Blossom for something really impactful, and in Hero there's so many possible choices to make. It's not the best deck in the world, but it can perform very well in the hands of the right player. So for that reason, it goes in the good players only tier. Majespecter is the only true Pendulum deck on this list, and it's a very solid strategy that got new support in Phantom Nightmare thanks to Niue. But the real benefit to the strategy is that Kirin is now back to one copy. Majespecter can set up a bunch of interruptions, and the majority of their monsters are untargetable, which is really cool. But while it does have weaknesses, one of the biggest advantages it has is that a lot of players don't really know what it wants to do. Well, obviously it can set up a copy of Kieran for a bounce, and it can use some generic extra deck boss monsters too, but it also can set up Secret Village of the Spellcasters or Necro Valley, which are both searchable in the deck. But the big thing with this deck is that it really wants to play Crossout Designator, and the reason why is because they need to have Niue Resolve. And Niue is one of the few Majespecter cards that can actually be targeted, so it's weak to something like Imperm or Valor, so playing Crossout Designator is key for that. And right now, crossouts are pretty expensive, which means you can't really fit all three of them into this specific strategy at our current budget. But even then, I have a lot of respect for what Majespecter can do, and for that reason, I'll place it in the good players only tier. Next up is Marincess. Now, a lot of people have been calling this like the water version of Snake Eyes, and I disagree, but I see where they're coming from. The deck has a lot of room for non-engine pieces, it has powerful one-card combos, and can set up a pretty scary end board, which is obviously really interesting. The issue with the deck is going to be that you really need to see your Marincess monsters, because if you don't see them, you can't do much, and the deck can have a hard time trading into certain hand traps that are really popular in the format today, notably Nibiru. But it still is a great choice nonetheless, and while it does have its weaknesses, they're few and far between. Even with its rise in popularity, I still think Marincess is slightly underrated, and honestly, it's a decent option. Melodious got new support in Legacy of Destruction, and it is great. This engine itself alone is fantastic at setting up negates for just powerful plays without even using a normal summon. But in the archetype itself, it is still even stronger. The deck is easily able to spit out a bunch of powerful extra deck monsters that can perform very well in the current format. But if you start off with a copy of First Movement Solo, while it is a great card for the archetype, it does lock you into Melodious monsters. Now, being locked into Melodious cards isn't so bad though, because you have great extra deck pieces, like for example Schuberta, which is like a quick effect DD Crow for 3 cards, which is really cool. You also have Flowering Etoile, which is a non-target bounce, kind of like Hieratic Seal of the Heavenly Spheres. It's just really solid forms of removal that the deck has access to. But on top of that, First Movement Solo is not a guaranteed must-have in the deck. Sure, it's really nice to play, especially if you're playing a pure version of the deck, but Ostinato is just a better one-card starter for the strategy, in my opinion. If you're going to an event, don't be surprised if you're matched up against at least one Melodious player. It's definitely a top-tier threat. Ninjas are, well, ninjas. Look, don't get me wrong, I really enjoy ninjas, I like their game plan, I like their strategy, but it's just not the format for them right now. The best form of interruption that ninjas have at the moment is going to be to Book of Moon certain cards, and that's really not as good as you'd want it to be in this specific format. Ninjas belong in the just don't tier. As for Phantom Knights, who would have thought that even without the Horus cards, PK could still be a pretty good strategy in 2024. There are so many great cards in the PK strategy, and the end board is still really threatening. And of course, it's one of the best decks in terms of recycling its own resources, which we really love. It can set up great cards like Appaloosa, Utopic Draco Future, obviously Phantom Knight's Fogblade is a great option too. The Horus cards make the deck so much stronger, but if you want a good alternative for those cards, you would go with something like the Adventure Package, which offers another Omni Negate for the deck. But PK just isn't at the same level as other decks in this format. You really want to make sure you're comfortable with the strategy before preparing to bring it to an event. So for that reason, Phantom Knight goes in the good players only tier. Purrely is a budget deck. Look, you can pick up an entire core of the Purrely cards for less than $100, and that's going to get even better once Rarity Collection 2 releases at the end of the month, because all the expensive cards in Purrely are going to be released in that set. It's not the most popular deck in the format right now, but does have a lot of really cool things going for it. Obviously, the Happiness OTK is really strong, but even more important than that is going to be that Expurely Noir is an absolute pain to deal with. So you gotta make sure you're prepared to deal with the strategy if it gets more popular. But I'll make the Purrely community proud and place it as a top tier threat. Raidraptor is another great deck. It can do so many awesome things, but if you're left uninterrupted, you usually want to go and summon out a copy of Ultimate Falcon and Rebellion Falcon, both of which are so hard to deal with for a lot of different decks. The deck has in-archetype forms of protection too, thanks to Raider's Wing, helping protect your copy of Raider's Knight, which is the choke point of the strategy, and because of that, it can get to its combo fairly easily, and it also doesn't care too much about many other hand traps in the format. It also has a lot of space for hand traps, which means it can do a lot of good things in the format today. And it's for those reasons that Raidraptor is also a top tier threat. Up next is Runick Spright. Now listen, I love this variant of Runick. It is my second favorite variant of Runick in the format today, behind Bestial Runick exactly. But I also can appreciate that it's not the best way to play the strategy right now. Sure, the Spright cards are good, but I don't think it's that hot of a take if I were to say the Runick cards are just better right now. With all the hand traps in the game, it's very likely that the Spright cards get interrupted before they get to their full combo, and even if they don't, there are so many awesome board breakers in the format too. And with decks being able to play so much non-engine, Runick Spright just can't play as much of it, which does make it fall behind at least a little bit. Maybe I'm hating, but in my opinion, Runick Spright is a real challenge. On the other hand though is Runick Stun. Now while Runick Spright was much lower on the tier list, Runick Stun will be significantly higher. This right now, unfortunately, is the best way to play the Runick cards. Not necessarily because you have so many hand traps and whatnot, but because you can play a lot of really powerful stun tools like a Mono YuGiOh, Inspector Border, a bunch of floodgates, and really stop your opponent from getting to their game plan while you keep getting card advantage over the course of the entire turn and eventually milling them out. While you're likely going to win a bunch of games while playing Runick Stun, you're not going to be making any friends, so just ask, who's the real winner here? I want to put this deck into the just don't tier list because I think no one should be playing this strategy, but I can't, it's just way too good. Runick Stun is a top tier threat. Sharks are a very fun deck that I enjoy playing from time to time. It can end on some really cool combos including Stealth Dragon to turn all monsters into water type, which is really good especially against Tenpai Dragon, but it can also set up double Totally Awesome or Utopic Draco Future or even all the full armor Xyz cards too. And while I really like the deck, it does take a lot of dedication to play it correctly and make sure it's at its full potential. And for that reason, I'm placing Sharks in the good players only tier. Yeah, I know Sky Striker fans, Engage is back to 3 copies, so the deck is pretty much at full power once again, but that doesn't mean it's going to be a top tier deck. The fact that Sky Striker has topped a couple regionals and is seeing play as an engine in a couple of different decks does give me some hope that it can do very well in the format, but honestly, I just don't think it's good enough right now. A lot needs to go right for Sky Striker to perform well in this format, and that's even at full strength. But on a budget, it becomes even more challenging because the deck loves Triple Tactics Thrust, and the deck just can't really play that at this current budget that we're at. And yeah, Flu also loves Triple Tactics Thrust, but it doesn't need it as much, and that's why Striker kind of has a harder time in this current meta. If you're on a budget, you can definitely play pure Sky Striker, but it'll be a real challenge. Now Sky Striker Orcust, that is a deck that can pop off. It's basically a full power 2018-19 strategy minus Linkuriboh that can really do some amazing things and great combos. It can use the Striker cards as an engine to get extra pieces of interruption or negation in the form of Widow Anchor for example, but it can also set up the Orcust package extremely well too, which means they can get a ton of summons and powerful link climbing tools as well. But one of my absolute favorite things the deck can do is resolve the effect of Topologic Bomber Dragon like 3 or 4 times in a single turn because of all the constant summoning it can do to just wipe the board over and over. Now I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but with Gearsu, Harp Horror, and Engage all back to 3 copies, I actually believe that this deck has a lot of potential. But for the time being, I'll place it in the good players only tier. Superheavy Samurai is probably one of the best pure combo decks you could be playing if you're on a budget. If you like these big wombo combo break my board style of decks, then this might just be the strategy for you. Because all the cards in the engine are very inexpensive, you could definitely pick up a big boss monster in the form of Bishal Dispatter, which would normally be out of budget at that $100 price point. But even with Dispatter in the picture, you can even set up powerful cards like Appaloosa and of course Naturia Beast as well. Even with the Link 1 banned, I still think it's a decent option. Swordsoul has been untouched by the ban list. The entire archetype is back and you have of course Protoss as well. Well, I mean, Baronne got banned, but that's not so bad, is it? No, it's pretty bad. You know, Swordsoul right now was like the face of the best budget decks in the format, and while the deck had its own in-archetype boss monsters, Baronne was the real boss of the strategy. And I don't care about Protoss being back in the format, I really don't, okay? The fact that Baronne is gone means this deck is weak to so many cards. It's weak to pretty much every single board breaker, it's weak to Nibiru, and it's weak to a lot of different decks that have really powerful engine as well. It can do some gimmicky stuff with Protoss back in the format, but I don't really respect it. And yes, even with Baronne banned, I would rather play Ghoti than Swordsoul. So in my opinion, just don't play Swordsoul. Up next is Tenpai Dragon, and yes, it is a budget deck. I don't want to hear anything about Trident Dragon, you do not need that card for the strategy. Sure, it helps sometimes, but it's not mandatory to play. I've been playing Tenpai Dragon at my locals since its release, and honestly, I've only gone to Trident Dragon maybe like 2 or 3 times total. Every other time, I was able to OTK without it, so it's not super necessary. But the rest of the deck is very affordable. Everything else is like commons and super rares, and that's pretty much it. Even with Pydra being as expensive as it is, you can definitely play the deck for less than $100. And you can also fit in a ton of non-engine. Whatever is your favorite non-engine or non-engine you already have, you can fit into this deck and make it perform very well. Even without Trident Dragon, it's my opinion that this is still the best budget deck in the game. It is definitely a top tier threat. And finally, we have Traptrix. Traptrix has a very solid engine that can do a lot of really cool things, but it's still a trap deck that really wants to go first. Any deck that wants to go first and has an almost impossible task of going second, like these trap decks, is going to have a really hard time. Especially because in this current format, you can't pair the Traptrix cards with the Ragnaraka cards, for example, to give it an extra leg up in the format because it would go over our budget. But when Traptrix can go first and is left uninterrupted, it can set up a really good engine that can just constantly recurse resources and is very difficult to deal with. But that's so hard to do this format because of all the hand traps running around, and for that reason, it's a real challenge. And there you have it, my tier list for the best budget decks in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is looking like this over here. Honestly, I'm pretty happy with the list. I find that there's so many good budget decks available right now that it was kind of hard to differentiate them. But if you want to hear my thoughts on a deck that didn't get covered in this video, or if you felt I made a mistake on one of the decks I did speak about, let me know down in the comments. While you're down there, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and of course subscribe to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos. Check out my sponsor, Imperium Duelist, and use code OSHEA10, OSHEA10 for 10% off your order. And of course, follow me on Twitter and join the Discord server, both of which are linked in the description. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.